thank you for joining today. I'm very excited that y'all are able to come today. I know that with the government shutdown, we've been having a few that can't join us today. So on the bright side that this is recorded today and everyone can always watch it back and just learn a little bit more about this training. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Gulf Coast, the Coast Resilience Institute RAD training for coastal land stewards. My name is Nina Davis, and I work with Mississippi State University, the Coastal Research and Extension Center, for a program called PLACE. Today, we'll explore the RAD framework and think about how it applies to the landscape challenges you work with. Just a quick note before we begin, since the last time I shared this training, I attended a fantastic RAD workshop led by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at the CCAS Symposium last month, and I've incorporated some of their content, and you'll see acknowledgments on some of the slides, but I just wanted to make sure to give them credit for helping me shape some of what you'll see and thank them for sharing their materials that have helped strengthen this training today. So here's how we'll spend our time together. We'll start with some opening reflections, just a chance for you to introduce yourself and think a bit about how you approach land management in your own work. Then we'll move into a RAD overview where I'll walk us through what resist, accept, and direct mean, how they differ, and how you might decide what is the right fit for a particular site. And then after that, we'll do a walkthrough of some examples. I'll share a few scenarios. We'll talk about possible approaches, and you'll have a chance to compare your ideas to what has been mapped out. I have 4 examples, and depending on time, we'll see how many we get through. But we do have a worksheet that I'll be putting in the chat, but you should have also received an email with that worksheet from Tracy if you would like to download that before we get started, just so that you can look through it and make sure that you are able to look at the worksheet and get that downloaded. And then I'll share the answer key in a follow-up email. And then we'll wrap up with some common challenges and takeaways. And finally, we'll talk about some next steps, including the possibility of a more in-depth part 2 where we apply RAD to real sites that you guys bring to the table. All right, so just to get us started, I'd like everyone to briefly introduce themselves in the chat to one another and then reply to this prompt. This will help us get a feel for the different perspectives in the room, and you'll see why that's important once we start working through the RAD framework. So just take a moment to put that in the chat. I'll start with what I feel like my role is. So again, you know, I'm Nina Davis. I work for the Mississippi State University Extension Center. I'm more of a connector, so my role isn't to directly manage land myself, but I do value the way our land managers connect to people, to nature, and to each other. So whether it's a marsh, a working waterfront, or a city park, they both hold value. So for me, management looks like connecting people with the resources, the science, and the partnerships they need to make decisions. So I'll give you just a few moments to place your answers in the chat. Then we'll move forward. All right, so what is a RAD approach to management? This is a coastal decision or a decision support tool for making practical solutions to overwhelming problems. So before we get into the details of each pathway, let's talk a little bit about the RAD framework as a whole. RAD stands for resist, accept, and direct, and it's a decision-making approach developed by land resource managers to help guide responses to unavoidable change. At its core, RAD gives us a shared language for talking about change. So we can ask, should we resist change by holding on to what we have? Should we accept change and focus our efforts elsewhere? Or should we direct change toward a future that we choose? Importantly, these are intentional decisions. They're not accidental outcomes. In other words, RAD is about looking ahead, understanding what's coming, and making a conscious choice about where to put our time, our money, and our effort. One key thing I want you to remember is RAD isn't a prescription. It's not telling you what to do. It's giving you a framework so you can make decisions that align with your mission, your resources, and your community's values. So this framework was developed as a way to help managers respond intentionally to transformational changes in ecosystems. It was asserted that there are really three possible management responses when a system is undergoing major change. We have resist, which is to actively intervene to reduce vulnerability to change or restore conditions where change has already occurred. And then accepting is allowing our ecosystems to drift into new, unprecedented conditions, often with uncertain consequences. To direct is to guide or facilitate change by intervening to transform ecosystems into a new state that is more aligned with the emerging climates and better able to sustain our desired ecosystem services. Now, it's important to understand that RAD is not a spectrum where one action is simply between the others. Instead, each option differs in two dimensions. And those two dimensions are the intensity of intervention required and the deviation from historical conditions involved. So, taking a look at our diagram here, low deviation from historical conditions and high intervention might lead us to resist, working towards restoring or maintaining our historical conditions. High deviation from historical conditions, but low intervention lead us towards accepting, letting that change occur without heavy investment in prevention. And then high deviation and high intervention point us towards directing, actively shaping new trajectory away from the past. So in practice, RAD gives us a menu of options, not a ladder decline. You might choose one approach for one part of a landscape and a completely different one for another. It all comes down to the context, feasibility, and your objectives. So let's break down each one a little bit more. So resist means working actively to maintain existing or historical conditions in a system. Even as pressures for change mount, this often involves significant intervention. For example, that could be reinforcing infrastructure, restoring habitats to a historical baseline, controlling our invasive species, maintaining water levels or sediment patterns. We might choose resist when a site has high ecological, cultural, or economic value that we want to preserve, or when the impacts of change would just strictly be unacceptable. But resist can also be resource intensive, and in some cases, it may only buy us time rather than completely preventing that change. And that's why part of applying RAD is asking, is the investment worth it for the outcomes we can achieve? Accept is when we make a deliberate choice to allow change to happen without trying to hold on to those past conditions. So this is not the same as doing nothing. Accepting means recognizing that the existing efforts would be unsustainable, ineffective, or misaligned with our goals, and instead focusing our resources elsewhere. So for example, letting a low-lying wetland convert to open water as sea levels rise, or allowing a forest to transition to grassland if drought conditions make trees unsustainable, or choosing not to rebuild infrastructure in a repeatedly flooded zone. So accepting could free up resources for other priorities, but it may also mean losing our valued features or a function. So that's why it's important to maybe pair accept with a plan for what comes next, like supporting our communities or our ecosystems as they adapt to the new realities. Directing means guiding the system toward a desired future condition. So one way that may be very different from its historical state. So direct is proactive. It's not just about letting that change happen, but actively shaping what it becomes. An example could include restoring our inland wetlands to serve as new habitat as coastal marshes are lost, or creating corridors for species migration to anticipated future ranges, or designing urban green space that can handle hotter, wetter climates. So direct can be innovative and future focused, but it also comes with its own slew of uncertainties. Ecosystems may not respond as expected, and it often requires collaboration, experimentation, and long-term commitment. The big question with direct is, if we can't keep the past, what future do we work toward? So one of the most important things to remember is that RAD is not a ladder. And what we mean by that is these aren't steps you climb in a specific order or levels that you have to graduate through. It's not first you resist, then you accept, then you direct. Instead, resist, accept, and direct are three distinct valid options that you can choose based on your goals, your objectives, your values, and what's feasible for a given place. In fact, you might actually choose all three across different parts of the landscape or even over time. So the right choice depends on the situation, not on where you are in progression. So again, RAD is not a menu. It is a menu, it's not a ladder. And the most important thing is being intentional about which option you choose and why. I will just pause for a brief moment before we move forward to see if anyone has any questions. I will monitor the chat. All right, well, we have another opportunity for questions, so we will move forward. So now that we've given a chance to talk about what the RAD framework is, let's look at how to actually use it in practice, this step-by-step process. So when you're thinking about applying RAD, it helps to walk through a simple structured process. First, you start with your goal. What is it that you're really trying to sustain or achieve? This might be something like maintaining viable nesting habitat, supporting a key species, or protecting cultural resources. Then you move on to setting clear objectives that support that goal. Objectives make the goal measurable and they help you know when you've succeeded. Next, you identify your drivers of change. What's shifting in your system? This could be sea level rise, salinity, erosion, invasive species, just whatever is putting pressure on that system. And then once you understand your drivers, you can explore your RAD strategies. What could you resist? What could you accept? And what might you want to direct toward a new condition? After that, document your actions. What specific steps would align with each strategy? And then finally, you'll assess the trade-offs. Think about your feasibility. Think about the costs, the values, and who's affected. Remember, this isn't a one-time process. RAD is iterative. So you'll revisit these steps as conditions and priorities evolve. A really useful part of RAD is building that menu, a list of all the possible things you could do. Notice the wording. This is about the could do, not the should do. So this is a chance to be creative. This is your creative space. When you're brainstorming a RAD menu, include ideas on your resist, accept, and direct, even if some of them feel a little bit outside of the box. So the goal is to capture a wide range of options, from small scale actions to big picture shifts across different timeframes or parts of the landscape. Once you have your menu, you can start to think about your trade-offs, what's feasible, what's affordable, and what aligns with your community's values. The important thing is that this menu helps you explore what's possible. You don't have to decide right away. That part comes later when you're matching actions to your goals and your capacity. So again, this broad menu gives you flexibility when conditions change, and it's easier to pivot if you've already gone through and thought through your options. So let's walk through a quick example so you can see how this process looks in action. In this case, our driver of change is sea level rise, and we're focused on maintaining nesting habitat for sea turtles. So under a resist strategy, our goal is to maintain viable nesting habitat on the island, and our objective could be something like preserve nesting sites for the next decade. To achieve that, actions might include beach nourishment or dune rebuilding, basically trying to hold the line and buy more time. Under a direct strategy, our goal might still be to support that nesting success, but we'd shift the objective to create suitable nesting habitat inland or on higher ground. Actions could include identifying new sites, acquiring land, or managing vegetation to create conditions that turtles need. And finally, under accept, the goal might shift to maintain regional nesting success instead of focusing on this specific island. So we might cease major intervention, monitor change, and redirect resources to other conservation areas. So the key takeaway here is that all three strategies connect back to the shared goal, sustaining nesting success. But the objectives and actions look different based on how we choose to manage change. So here's an important piece that sometimes gets overlooked with RAD. and that's revisiting goals and objectives. So RAD isn't a one-time decision. As conditions change, we might realize that our original objectives no longer fit the reality on the ground. That doesn't mean that we abandon that goal. It means we adapt our path to reach it. This kind of revision often comes up in our accept scenarios when we recognize change is happening and we do need to redefine success in achievable terms. So this next piece is an example. This is from a RAD workshop hosted by the Fish and Wildlife Service in the Florida Keys. This is one of the slides that Beth Sties with Fish and Wildlife shared with me after I attended one of her RAD workshops. So huge thanks to her. But you see here that the goal was to maintain a viable population of key deer in the Florida Keys. And originally, their objective was to maintain natural sources of fresh water for key deer. The driver of change is sea level rise and storm surge, resulting in altered water chemistry, with salinization of inland sources of freshwater sources. So the management implication was loss of natural freshwater sources for key deer. They came to the conclusion that they would need to allow that change to the system to occur, with salinization and loss of natural freshwater sources. Now, with accepting this wasn't giving up, they decided that they needed to just rethink their objective. Instead of trying to maintain natural sources of fresh water, they decided that they would maintain just simply sources of fresh water for key deer, still meeting their goal of maintaining that viable population of key deer in the Florida Keys. But they accepted that they would no longer have those natural sources. They would just go back to the drawing board to come up with alternative actions to meet this new objective. And some of those alternative actions to meet that objective could end up leaning towards the resisting side of using RAD or the directing side, but they did accept that natural sources of fresh water were no longer possible. So you can kind of see the intertwining of looking at accepting, resisting, and directing all in the same area, and not really totally trying to isolate yourself to the box of resist, accept, and direct, but really trying to think about your goals and objectives. Because at the end of the day, that's the important piece of using this decision support tool. So again, the goal, the why, stays the same, but the objectives, those hows, evolve. So regularly revisiting your objectives keeps your management both realistic and responsive. And you should revisit when conditions shift, actions just are too difficult and infeasible, or new opportunities arise. Maybe money's come around, and now you have the option to explore resisting and directing a little bit more thoroughly. So now that we've covered the basic definitions of RAD, let's look at how we might actually decide which path to take in a real-world situation. This decision tree is a tool to help managers move from recognizing change to deciding on an intentional response. The process starts with understanding the degree of change or the threat. Is it small and incremental, or is it rapid and transformational? From there, we think about feasibility. Do we have the resources? Do we have the capacity and the authority to intervene? If intervention is possible, we then weigh what kind of intervention is an approach and sustainable. So that's where the RAD decision-making questions come in. What changes are already happening or likely to happen at this site? What do we care about most in this place? What are the ecological, cultural, or economic values at stake? And that is why I asked you at the beginning what your values were, because it's very important to keep that in. If your values are to maintain connection, then maybe that's something that you consider when you're going through your accepting, resist, and direct pathways. You might also ask yourself what's feasible given your resources, your partnerships, and the level of risk you're willing to take. And then finally, what future conditions do you want to manage toward? What would success look like, even if it's different from the past? So as you follow the branches of the tree, these questions help clarify your direction. If high intervention is possible, and the goal is to maintain historical conditions, the tree points to resist. If low intervention is feasible and you're willing to allow change, it points towards accept. If high intervention is possible, but the goal is to move toward a new climate-ready state, then you'll direct. So the important takeaway is that this process is intentional and transparent. It's It's not about stumbling into a path by default, but about clearly articulating your why and why that decision was made and how it aligns with the site's objectives, the feasibility, and its values. So another way to strengthen your adaptation planning is to think in terms of portfolios and pathways. A RAD portfolio is when you use more than one strategy, maybe resist in one area, accept in another, and direct somewhere else. So this mix helps you spread risk and management across different conditions. No single strategy works everywhere. So a RAD pathway looks at how your actions might change over time, starting with one strategy and transitioning to another one as conditions evolve. For example, you might resist now while conditions are manageable, and then direct later as sea level rise accelerates. Pathways also rely on monitoring and triggering points. There are indicators that tell you when it's time to revisit your strategy. So together, portfolios and pathways make your plan more adaptive, more realistic, and more resilient. So finally, let's connect RAD to scenario and pathway planning. So we know the future is uncertain. So instead of trying to predict one outcome, we plan for multiple plausible futures. Scenario planning helps us explore how systems might respond under different conditions. High sea level rise, more frequent storms, slower change, and so on. So for each scenario, you can outline a RAD pathway using simple if-then statements. For example, if salinity exceeds 10 parts per thousand, then shift from a resist strategy to a direct and begin planting salt-tolerant species. These statements help you recognize trigger points and respond proactively instead of waiting until it's too late. So the main takeaway here is to build flexibility into your plan. It's not about locking into one choice. It's not about knowing when. It's just about knowing when and then how to pivot. So here we have scenario A, you might start resisting. And then there's a trigger point, and that could be increased sea level rise, more frequent storms. Maybe sea level rise finally reaches to a certain measurement, and then you'll direct. And then you have another trigger point, and then you realize that you simply need to accept. And maybe that means accepting here, but deciding to resist and direct somewhere else. So just think about that when you're connecting your RAD to scenario and pathway planning. Take another moment of questions. All right, well, now we're going to get to work through some RAD, working through RAD together. We have 4 RAD scenarios. So Tracy emailed everyone your scenarios worksheet. And so you'll be able to download that worksheet from your email, or we'll also place it in the chat again. So you're going to download your scenarios worksheet from the Zoom chat or your email. And then we're going to split into some Zoom breakout rooms. So I'm going to give everyone an opportunity to look through that chat or download from your email, download that scenarios worksheet. And I just want to take a moment to make sure that everyone is able to access that before we get into breakout groups. But then we're going to split into some breakout groups. And I know we don't have a whole lot today, so we'll probably just do 2. But we're going to work as a group or individually within that working group. So you're going to work in your Zoom breakout room, and you're going to work through each of the 4 scenarios sort of at your own pace, but you're also feel free to talk to another and learn from one another as you're working through these 4 scenarios. And so in your worksheet, you're going to read the prompt, and you're going to sort and match your resist, accept, and direct with a few goals and objectives, a few actions, pros and cons. And so you'll have a RAD table that you'll fill in. And then there are a few questions to reflect on your responses and reflect on the prompt that you were given. And I want you to take a moment to compare your answers within your group, talk amongst each other. We're going to take about 30 minutes for this. If we seem like we have a smaller group today, so if we feel like we've finished through it a little bit faster, then we'll join. but I want you to also choose one member to report back to the entire group, just so that we can have a little bit of a conversation about how you used RAD and how you found RAD. So when you report back, you could either choose a challenge that you had when it came to working through the RAD scenario, something that you liked about the RAD scenario or found interesting, just whatever you would like to report back that you found interesting as you work through your scenarios. Um, I'm going to read the answers, but before I give you guys like and I want to say in some sense there is an answer key because there is some kind of like thought process to some of what you guys heard with the scenarios and the questions and the information that was given. But there's also, you notice that there's like possible goals, possible objectives, and possible pros and cons. So there's more beyond what I've put on the scenarios and question sheet, and there's more beyond some of what I have on the answer key, but I do want to walk through some of the answers with you just to make sure that it kind of feels like we're a little bit on the same page. But before I do that, I wanted to kind of gauge the group that we have here today and just ask if anyone was interested in reporting back on behalf of the breakout group that you were in on any challenges, questions, or main takeaways that seemed to pop up while you were going through the questions. So I'll start out with breakout room one, which I believe was Melinda and Steve, and see if anyone has anything interesting to share. Steve,
I'll
you look
just
good.
share
Oh,
real
yeah, there you
quick.
go.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
was looking at Melinda. I didn't know she was going off mute. So we were just starting the conversation about beach
Okay.
tree nourishment, and we both, for scenario one, and both thought that could fit in resist and direct potentially. So
Yes.
I
Yeah.
think kind of well, I can't speak for Melinda. Sometimes I read into questions more than I probably need to, but that was something that we were just about to talk about.
Okay. And we'll go over how about some of these things could go into resist, accept, or direct, depending on how you're also thinking about the question, because they're a little bit, they're dependent on the land manager. So we'll walk through that. Through Andrew James, and I don't think I know that you have MDJ. I'm not sure if I caught your name in the chat, but does anyone want to report out from Breakout Group 2?
I mean, I can kind of echo what Steve also said. I feel like there's a lot of interpretation on some of these that could apply in multiple areas. But I
Hmm.
think one of the things we were discussing too is how money kind of tends to constrain almost all of these decisions. So if,
Definitely.
if money was not an issue and we had infinite funds, I think that would definitely allow us to make more decisions in the direct side of things. But
Hmm.
as you start to have limitations with budget, I think a lot of times we move towards resisting and accepting.
Definitely. And yeah, you definitely find that with like as money as an issue, which it most often is for anything that we do in our life, um, that might kind of make the decision for you. So that's why it's important to walk yourself through some of those decision-making questions. So I will go ahead and share my screen again, and we'll walk through the questions or the answers. All right. Small. All right, so for your first scenario, which was Barrier Island sea turtle habitat, scenario number one, your main drivers of change were sea level, it could be sea level rise, erosion, or storm overwash. And so one of your main focuses is maintaining nesting habitat for your endangered sea turtles. So for goal B, or for your goal of maintaining current nesting habitat on the island, that is your resist. And actions could include beach nourishment, rebuilding dunes, relocating sand, and some of the pros and cons of that could just be your pros could be maintaining existing nesting habitat. It aligns with familiar management strategies, and it could buy time, which resisting often does maybe buy time, but you might have to eventually move towards accepting or directing in later times as conditions evolve. Some of the cons, as Andrew said, is these things that are expensive. And then also, resisting might also just be temporary because, again, it buys time. You might also need to repeat the strategy of beach nourishment and rebuilding the dunes, and it could potentially just only delay loss. For accepting, your goal was allowing the island to degrade naturally and shift focus elsewhere. So your actions could include halting all habitat intervention or creating public education campaigns around habitat loss. And this one specifically with campaigning public education, I wanted to comment on something that we had during our last RAD workshop is that public education could potentially be applied to resisting, accepting, and directing strategies. So it kind of just all depends on what you're campaigning specifically and what you're trying to teach in that public education. But as Steve mentioned, like, some of these actions could be applied to all three, maybe resisting and directing. So it just kind of depends on your thought processes you're moving through some of those decision-making questions and what your goals and objectives are. For your pros for accepting, it can free up resources and it reflects maybe your realistic trajectory as climate conditions evolve, and it could also promote awareness. Cons is obviously you're losing that nesting habitat and you could potentially have potential species decline. For directing, that it was goal C, creating a new nesting habitat in a safer location. Um, your actions could include identifying alternate nesting sites inland, managing predator control at new nesting areas, and acquiring land for new nesting habitat. Pros are long-term resilience, proactive adaptation. Cons require upfront investment, land acquisition, planning, stakeholder engagement. So I know you guys had the opportunity to reflect on your worksheet, but a key takeaway here is maybe that a portfolio approach may work best. You might want to resist in a short term, high priority areas, while also planning direct actions for long-term resilience. All right, so that was scenario number 1. For scenario number 2, for housing in flood-prone areas, some of the drivers of change for this could be hurricanes, sea level rise, storm surge. So your focus might be on housing safety and long-term community resilience. So for resist, the goal is keeping homes in their current locations. Some of your actions might be reinforcing levees and seawalls, elevating existing homes, and creating new higher elevation code for hurricane resistance. Your pros are that it protects current residents, it might maintain the tax base and continuity. The cons are that it's costly, it's not sustainable long term, and it may create false sense of security. As I'm going through the resist for the second scenario, I hope that you kind of see some of the consistent pros and cons is that it's maybe not sustainable long term oftentimes, and it can be costly to resist, especially as conditions continue. And so resisting might be a costly choice for you. For accepting that is goal of ending housing in the most vulnerable areas and repurposing that land. So actions can include offering buyouts and relocation assistance, removing damaged infrastructure, designating vulnerable areas as open space or wetlands. Some of your pros are that it reduces long-term risk, restores the natural floodplain, and it's cost effective over time. But you do get that loss of community identity, there's social disruption and equity concerns. And then for directing, it's building safer housing in more strategic locations, building affordable storm resilient homes inland, creating new higher elevation codes, which could appear here too as enabling strategy. You saw that we had creating new higher elevation codes and resisting as well, but it could work for directing as well. Again, some of those actions could change depending on what you're doing. The pros is enables continuity, there's long-term resilience, and it could integrate planning and design. However, it could require very significant funding, planning, and engagement. So a potential key takeaway here is you might want to consider pairing accept, where you're phasing out some of those vulnerable areas, with direct, where you're redeveloping in safe zones. And then you would maybe want to make sure that you're addressing equity and community input early on as you're making these decisions. As we've gone through scenario number 1 and scenario number 2, did anyone feel like they didn't get these answers? Do they feel like they got different responses that they wanted to discuss with the group or ask of me before I move on to scenario number 3? All right, we'll move on to scenario number 3. I also like to add, I mentioned it during in my breakout group with Steve and Melinda, but I will be sharing out the answer key just so that you could have access to these resources afterwards. Scenario number 3. So some of your drivers of change for this could be flooding, storms, and sea level rises. This is a coastal health clinic. So your focus is on continuity of healthcare for vulnerable populations. So in order to resist, your goal is to maintain healthcare services at the current location. Your actions could include retrofitting the clinic to withstand storms and floods, improving drainage and infrastructure, creating emergency operation protocols. Pros is that it keeps a trusted facility in place and it maintains that local access. However, it's costly. There's an ongoing risk of increased storm surge and sea level rise, flooding, and it may just become infeasible over time. For accepting, you're going to phase out the clinic and shift services elsewhere. So this would include removing the existing facility, referring patients to inland clinics, and maybe providing some telemedicine and transportation vouchers. This reduces exposure to risk and frees resources for resilient facilities. However, you have loss of community access and it may affect vulnerable patients. For directing, you would redesign health delivery for changing conditions. Actions would include establishing mobile clinics or floating units. Again, this could be considered one of those creative could do's that I mentioned earlier on, because I'd say mobile and floating clinics could feel a little bit outside of the box, but it's nice to still include it as a potential solution. And there's still ways that we can maybe create mobile floating clinics, as we do have mobile floating houses as well. So just a thought, but I wanted to point out that that could be considered an outside of the box action here, as we continue to creatively consider solutions. Another action could be building a new storm resilient clinic inland and providing telemedicine and transportation vouchers again. So you'll see that that kind of was in more than one section. It was in accepting and directing. Pros are that it's innovative, it's flexible, and it could build long-term resilience. However, this requires a major investment. It's costly and requires major planning and coordination. A way that you could combine some of these frameworks is you could combine resisting, which would be short-term continuity, with directing, which could be transitioning to new models. So you could accept complete relocation, but that may follow if the site becomes just untenable. But you could start with resisting and directing here. I'm starting to make sure that you're directing to new models, but you're going to continue resisting until you have maybe the funds in order to direct. You'll see here that there's kind of like a pattern. A lot of the times resisting is costly, directing is costly, accepting is maybe your lowest cost option. But resisting also usually might only work short term, and you might need to move towards accepting or directing in the long term. So you'll just kind of pick up on those consistencies between the resist, accept, and direct framework. So for scenario number 4, the driver of change here is altered hydrology, climate change, invasive species, and sedimentation. Your focus is ecosystem function, navigation, flood control, and recreation. I would like to point out the scenario number 4 is actually a real scenario. The Upper Mississippi River management scenario actually was a situation where land managers actually did work to apply resist, accept, and directing. So the options that I gave you there were options that they considered and worked on applying. And I will share that resource at the end of this workshop in an email. But I just wanted to point out that this is an actual example of applying the RAD workshop, where the other ones were just simple scenarios. So to resist, you might maintain or restore historical river conditions. So in order to do that, you'd maintain water control structures, dredge channels to prevent sedimentation, and control invasive species to protect native habitat. Your pros are that it preserves familiar ecological functions, it supports navigation and flood control. Again, it's very high cost and it may conflict with the ecological realities as climate conditions change, and it requires continual intervention. In order to accept, you allow the river to transform naturally, So you'll remove or modify water control structures, cease invasive species removal in certain areas. And this reduces maintenance costs. It allows natural adaptation, supports new ecosystem formation. Cons are that it's loss of some species or uses, and you might change the recreation or navigation of that area. To direct, you'd shape the river system for future ecological resilience. So some of the actions that they took was creating or restoring floodplain habitat for future hydrology. They managed vegetation for climate resilient species, and they enhanced fish passage and habitat connectivity. So some of the pros are that it's proactive adaptation, it enhances resilience in the long run and supports biodiversity. However, there's complex coordination to be done. It's a long planning horizon, and there's potential conflicts with other uses. So this is the key takeaway for this one is that upper Mississippi River management likely requires a portfolio. You might need to resist for navigation zones, direct for ecological resilience areas, and accept in less critical reaches. All right, so I wanted to next, as we wrap up, let's talk honestly about what can make using RAD challenging, because this framework is powerful, but it's not always easy to apply. But before I get into naming some of those few common challenges, I would like to pause and take a moment to see if anyone has any questions about the 4 scenarios before I move on with common challenges. All right, so I'll name a few common challenges that come up in conversations with land managers and community partners. And maybe some of those challenges popped up when you were going through your 4 scenarios. So first, there's uncertainty. We don't always have clear projections for what's coming or how fast. And that is why a portfolio and scenario pathway plan is important, because depending on your trigger points and depending on climate conditions as they evolve, you might need to move RAD strategies. Maybe you'll resist first, maybe you'll accept second, or maybe you'll resist first, direct, and then accept, because we don't always have clear projections on our climate conditions and for what's coming up and how fast that's going to come up. We also might have limited capacity. There's not enough time, staff, or funding to plan for change. And a lot of times that means we end up accepting even when we don't want to. Then there's also community or stakeholder resistance. Some RAD strategies may clash with public perception or emotional ties to that place. I could especially see community or stakeholder resistance when we're talking about the coastal health clinic, as relocating that health clinic might cause some community disruption, as that's a regularly visited location for patients. There's also decision paralysis. There's too many variables or fear of making the wrong choice. And then there's a values conflict. What's best for the ecosystem may not align with our cultural, economic, or even our political goals. So I would just challenge you to think about your challenges. Have you encountered any of these or others in your own work managing change? What makes decision making feel difficult or stuck? Because those are some things to discuss beforehand as you're walking through the RAD strategies, just to make sure that we kind of get out of that decision paralysis mode. So as we bring this session to a close, I'd like us to zoom back out and just reflect on what's sticking with you. So this could be something you learned, a question you're still sitting with, or something you want to explore. Feel free to put that out in the chat. If there's anything that you felt like was very interesting as you walked through your scenarios. But here are some key takeaways to just remember. RAD is a flexible, values-based framework. It's not a prescription or a checklist. Resist, accept, and direct are not really better or worse than each other. Each has its trade-offs. A lot of the times those trade-offs are costs or the economic value, and the right choice just really depends on the context. You're probably already doing RAD-like thinking. This framework just helps name and structure it. And then we don't have to make these decisions alone. And we'll need more conversations. We'll need more tools and collaboration to move from ideas to action. As you guys were in your breakout groups, I heard a lot of conversations. I heard you guys talking to one another to answer through your possible scenarios. And so it's really good to not try to apply the RAD framework alone. think about the RAD framework in a group. It's good to have an entire group of maybe land managers, extension associates, community resilience specialists, just an entire team to walk you through this RAD-like thinking, because you're not alone. And it's just good to collaborate as you go through possible inactions. Think about your could do's, not your should do's. You don't have to come up with a decision after you've gone through the RAD framework. It's just the RAD framework helps you think through your potential options, your trade-offs, your actions, but really consider that main goal and objective as you're walking through. So thank you all for being here today and really leaning into what I know is a complex and also sometimes uncomfortable conversation about change. So I hope this session gave you a foundation for starting to think about how RAD might support the work you're already doing or help you make more intentional decisions in the future. Before we wrap up, I'd really appreciate it if you could just take a couple of minutes to fill out the evaluation form that will be placed in the chat. Your feedback is really helpful for understanding what resonated, what could be improved, and what kinds of support might be useful going forward. We'll also follow up with an email that includes the links to some of the resources mentioned today. I have a RAD guide, those case studies, and then contact info if you'd like to reach out for future collaboration. So fill out that evaluation, but thanks again for the work you do and for being part of this conversation. Change is happening, and the more that we build these tools, relationships, and shared language, the better off we all are.